Adam Gries is trained in neuroscience, economics, and psychology, but went on to become a tech entrepreneur and angel investor. He's currently on a mission to end aging with his movement called Vitalism.
Everyone wants to live forever.
Here we talk all about longevity, whether supplements are going to make you live forever, where the longevity science is, why we in fact know very little about longevity because compared to other things like cancer, it's dramatically under-researched, and many other topics. Adam also lays out the goals of Vitalism and how it could facilitate processes like developing longevity-oriented cities or communities that could provide easy access to all the best longevity-boosting equipment, protocols, and so on.
But why doesn't Jeff Bezos fund it, or Bill Gates or whatever, right? Don't they want to live? The only thing that their money can't buy is time and health. There's something fundamental that's preventing them from investing in this.
If there was progress to be made on aging, it would have been done by now. There's probably scientists out there spending billions of dollars on this. If this could be done, it would have been done, but there's no progress, so this is probably impossible. But now you're kind of revealing that, wait, the incentive structures are not right. You don't really have a cycle that is conducive to actually making headway on this problem.
My name is Adam Gries. I'm a tech entrepreneur. I was born and raised in Israel and lived in the US as a kid. I studied neuroscience, economics, and psychology for undergrad. Thought I'd be a scientist, but then decided to be an entrepreneur. And then for about 15 years, give or take, I graduated in 2006. I've built all sorts of consumer products in tech. I'm also a self-taught software engineer, built a bunch of apps, games, reached about 80 million users on a variety of platforms, from Facebook to mobile, built everything from photo sharing, gaming products, a platform to help people learn English and languages online, an e-commerce platform. And then I've also been interested in longevity and other areas where I've been investing, etc. And I guess maybe that's a connection to vitalism and longevity in general. I've always been interested in longevity from an early age. Maybe in my teens, I realized, okay, what is the human condition? What is the I? And I pursued that investigation through meditation and other means and kind of the nature of life. And as soon as I was aware that there might be a way for us to address our mortality and aging, I thought, well, that is a really good idea. And so that's been in the back of my mind since maybe my teens or my early 20s, but it was kind of dormant for 15, 16 years. So I knew some people in the field. I started making a little bit of angel investing in the last couple of years, but I wasn't really involved. And then after COVID happened, I kind of woke up to the world of longevity and went through a whole journey that eventually led me to found Vitalism. I'm sure we may talk about different parts of that. Vitalism is the revolutionary movement against aging and death. Mm-hmm. Now, primarily death being the problem, but aging being the primary cause of death, and therefore the first thing that we should address. So that's what Vitalism is really. And, it's sounds pretty simple. I guess that the underlying idea behind it is that humanity should fight as hard as possible against death and aging. Mm-hmm. And it's not right now. And, we have good evidence for how hard humanity can fight from past events like World War II. The US spent 42% of its GDP for years to fight the war. And I think that's a good standard to think about when we consider what humanity can do when something is really important.
So is it safe to say that vitalism is basically a movement, or is it an organization, or how would you describe it?
So it's a movement in the sense that it's a philosophy, but it also has a practical goal of manifesting that philosophy into action. Mm. And so that's why movement is an appropriate name. Now, operationally, vitalism itself it's an entity that contains the ideas, meaning you don't want anybody to feel they can't identify as vitalist. Anybody should be able to do that if they resonate, they align with the ideas that we believe in, primarily that aging and death are humanity's major problem, primary problem, and that we need to address these problems as such. And we should do that by applying massive resources to confront them. Now, in terms of operationalizing that, because vitalism has a perspective that is applied, i.e., that governments, entities, individuals should do something to realign resources to this issue, there's kind of a natural convergence between vitalism, let's say the philosophy, and that could be encapsulated in writings, a website, communication, a group of people that identify as a community, and then certain actions like creating an entity like a nonprofit or a for-profit that's promoting this mission, creating an advocacy organization that has some political goal to try to push this ideology forward, this movement forward. And so you could think about vitalism itself as a philosophy when you think about the namespace, but I like to describe it as a movement because the birth of that philosophy comes from an idea of urgency to create change.
So it's kind of like a philosophy, but it's a philosophy plus the specific intention to actually take the necessary actions to fulfill. It's not just like, oh, it would be nice if we lived longer. It's like, okay, we are going to organize ourselves and create a community that will actually take the action steps necessary to make this happen.
Right.
And you're basically saying like, we have been able to congregate tons of resources to one specific goal and achieve a certain result. Mm-hmm. So why haven't we done the same thing to combat aging and death, which seems kind of like an obvious thing that would be nice. Obviously, it would be nice if that didn't exist. Okay.
Yeah, so from a first principles perspective, if you ask yourself, okay, this is clearly a set of bad things, aging, decrepitude, death. I mean, most people would agree with that statement. Like, death is bad. 99% would agree with that statement, or some large number. I mean, some people might say, oh, well, death isn't bad because I'll get to be with Jesus or whatever that is. But what they're really saying in that case is death isn't bad because there is no death. I'm going to the afterlife. So actually, they're not really answering the question, right? And so, yes, the vitalist perspective is that we should be doing something about this. I'll just give an example that's a bit of a parallel. If you think about the Enlightenment eventually also led to liberalism and the Spring of Nations and the American French Revolutions, which had these ideologies. And there's always this conversation around, is the ideology a product of a new economic or other reality? Or does the ideology drive the outcome? Mm-hmm. And it's hard to say which drives which. There's probably some correspondence or cycle there. But if you think about republicanism or the movement of liberalism, it's hard to dissociate that from the American Revolution or the French Revolution. So I like to think about it in similar terms. In other words, we're trying to carry out a global revolution to reorganize humanity's resources to achieve this important thing because of a value-driven perspective.
What's the first step to get it going?
It depends how you think about how change happens. My conclusion today, or rather my best idea, is that you need a hardcore of people who believe in a thing to coordinate effectively and then amplify the message and achieve more influence through capturing opportunities and finding ways to promote that message and create win-win situations for expanding groups of people. And what that means in the vitalist case is, if you look at resources, the US GDP is about 24.5 trillion. Global GDP is close to 100 trillion. So let's say that we wanted to allocate 1% of that to to fight aging and death directly. And what I mean by that is fight the root cause, not something down the line which is not going to push out maximum lifespan at all and not going to contribute to the understanding of the fundamental aging process very much, right? Because you could argue, well, trying to tackle heart disease or cancer, that's also fighting aging in some way, because these diseases of aging don't happen out of the blue. They happen at 1,000x greater incidence, directly correlate to age. So the issue there, it becomes a little fuzzy, is that a lot of the interventions are looking at a very pathological state, and they're not trying to understand the root causes, but rather just to either suppress the symptoms or eradicate that local pathological state. And of course, the problem with that is that even if we solve, let's say, cancer completely, we'd only be gaining a very small amount of lifespan because something else is going to knock people out.
You might solve cancer, but then you could die from a broken hip or heart disease or
a stroke or dementia or complications from diabetes, all of these so-called diseases of aging.
Which all crop up as you age, or once you hit a certain age, then you start to develop the risk for having those issues.
Right, a dramatically elevated risk. Now, of course, some of these diseases do happen to younger people. You may have had a bad luck of the draw and you get like predilection to cancer and you get it early, or some rare kind of thing. Or you have cholesteremia or something like that. You have highly elevated levels of cholesterol because of a genetic aberration or whatever. But yes, they generally happen with aging. Now, it's kind of weird because it's like, are they aging, or are they a result of aging? Or are they just things that happen at the same time as aging at a greater probability? It doesn't really matter. It's clear that they happen as a result of being in that state. When you talk about resource allocation, so you look at the $1 trillion that you want to apply, 1% of the global $100 trillion GDP, a lot of people might say, well, what does that exactly mean? What's included in that? When somebody is a biotech and they're trying to develop some intervention to solve a particular cancer, bladder cancer of this or that variety, is that a legitimate dollar amount that's been invested in combating aging and death? So how do you evaluate things? That's a really core question here. It's fundamental. And I would say that there are almost two ways to think about it, although the boundaries are a little blurry. One is to say, are the people working on the thing trying to work on the right thing in the way they self-describe? So in other words, the leaders of said lab or company, do they communicate to the members of their lab? Do they communicate to the public at large in their papers, which they try to publish in Nature, etc., that they're trying to address the root cause of aging and they're trying to address death? If they're not doing that, it just makes it, less likely they're going to make progress on that. It's just like a startup, right? You kind of go wherever you're going. And so if you're not going in the right direction, well, you're not going to get there. You're going to get wherever you're going. Yeah. So that's one core piece which most labs are not representing right now. So they might be working on a particular channel which is implicated in a particular cancer, et cetera, but they're not really even communicating that they're trying to understand the root cause of aging. And therefore, it's much less likely they'll make progress on it.
When you put it like that, it does seem kind of obvious, kind of like, why hasn't anybody done this before? It seems like such an obvious problem to try and tackle. It seems like it should be an obvious goal for this lab or that lab. What do you think is the reason behind that? Do you think it's, for example, people just don't think it's possible? It's like chasing the golden goose, or whatever metaphor you want to use? Or could it be a form of discouragement, like people saying, we haven't even solved cancer despite all this money spent on it. There's still no cure for cancer. How can we expect to have a cure for death? Or What do you think is
or
behind
for
that?
aging.
Yeah, there you go.
So I'll try to unpack that because there were multiple really important points there. Setting some context, today there may be about 300 labs or so that say they're working on aging. Now, that represents about 5,000 or so scientists. Just to give you a sense, probably about 1 million scientists were working on COVID. And when you think about cancer, maybe you have like hundreds of thousands of scientists working on cancer. So if you think that aging is the master problem of which cardiovascular risk, cancer, dementia, diabetes complications, etc., is the progenitor of, then you would say, wait a second, probably more people should be thinking about that, right? And not the downstream stuff. So that just sets kind of like the order of magnitudes difference. And then you'd say, well, okay, why isn't the money going in the direction of something more fundamental, which could create a massive change if we recognize that this is core to the problem? And a lot of people would agree. They'd say like, yes, aging is definitely the core thing that is raising the likelihood of these problems. So if we could address aging somewhat, that would help us with all of these issues. And that's pretty much what the Geroscience Hypothesis is arguing. So this is kind of this perspective that received this label recently, Geroscience, which is saying, hey, we don't necessarily even want to talk about death. We're just looking at these diseases of aging, and we're acknowledging that we're kind of hitting a wall or an asymptote. We've spent tens of billions on Alzheimer's research and hardly have anything. We started the war on cancer in the 70s, and we haven't won the war, even though there's been some progress against some cancers, et cetera. It's like not nothing, right? But we're hitting some level of diminishing returns. And because we're kind of coming up against maybe some sort of maximum in terms of our lifespan, which is governed much more by aging than anything else, which ties to what we were talking about before, meaning if you don't die from this, you'll die from that. So no matter what we solve, something else will kill you. But when you ask yourself, well, okay, we can acknowledge this makes sense, but where's the money going to come from to drive that fundamental research? You need to start looking at where money comes from in general for innovation, which ties also to another question, which is how does innovation happen in general? If we want to accelerate innovation, we should probably have some mental model of that. So when you think about where the money comes from, by and large, globally, the largest funder of biomedical research is the NIH, the National Institutes of Health in the US. This is an organization that's been around for 100 and something years. It started out as the Bureau of, it was the Naval Institute, and it was initially formed to control infectious diseases that were brought in by seafarers who came to the US. And over time, it developed to cover all sorts of diseases and to try to serve a public health and research function. This organization has about $50 billion in budget a year. And a lot of the researchers who are working on any type of biomedical stuff are effectively working for the NIH in the sense that that's where their grant is coming from, or a majority of their money. So if you're a researcher at a university and you're saying, hey, why doesn't that researcher research aging? Why are they researching this cancer or that cancer, or this dementia or that dementia? A lot of the reason is that there's a grant, and that grant that they need to file needs to live up to certain parameters for it to be approved by the NIH. And the NIH has congressional mandates for what it can fund. And those congressional mandates are influenced by public opinion. And so I call this a bit of this vicious cycle of research and innovation, or lack thereof in this case, which is that you have patient groups and you have pharma, which are kind of like the squeaky wheel, meaning, my mom had cancer, my cousin had heart disease. This pharma is agitating for this intervention to be developed because there are patients who could benefit, and they know that there's a financial model behind it, right? Because that's what pharma understands. You develop this thing, it passes trials, and maybe it's a blockbuster, and hopefully it helps people, right? That's the goal. I mean, in the kind of noble version of what these drug companies want to do. Now, these two groups have a lot of power because they have money and they have an acute problem, and they impact lawmakers. Lawmakers define mandates, and those mandates define where the grants generally go. And they're also, I mean, of course, people at the NIH have their own discretion to some degree, but they're not free of this influence. It's very important because it's a government organization after all. And so a lot of the money ends up going to these squeaky wheels, which are the diseases. And this has to do with something which is much more fundamentally human than, pursuing profit or anything like that. It's the fact that humans are not built for long-term thinking. They want to address something which is acute in the here and now. I mean, just look at anything in humanity, from quarterly earnings and how that changes the way public companies are run, or from election cycles and how, after the second year, a president is just spending all their time thinking about the next election in the US, and similarly in other countries. So just to close out that, what I call a vicious cycle, then these NIH funds go, and these NIH funds probably represent, I don't know, maybe half, maybe even more of all biomedical research funding in the world. Okay, so this is a huge amount of the money. And that money then funds this research, which then, if you think about yourself as a PI in a lab, so let's say you work at UT Austin, you have a lab, you got this grant, you're looking at cancer, et cetera. What's your dream? Your dream is to get a spinoff from the university, which is biotech, which you own part of. And that biotech then gets funded and goes through clinical trials, and then often gets bought out by a pharma or somehow becomes a blockbuster intervention, which benefits a lot of people and makes you a gajillionaire, right? That's like how that story kind of unfolds in the positive, happy path. And so that's really what ends up happening. You have all these PIs working on all these diseases. They try to get these outcomes, which would then go to pharma through the FDA. And of course, the FDA operates within a system. The FDA was founded to protect people. It used to be called the Bureau of Chemistry. And when people started producing all sorts of things in the US with chemistry, and of course, we're talking just about the US, but this is true of a lot of other places in the world, especially Europe. The patterns are very similar. A lot of people were hurt because unscrupulous businesses were selling snake oil or harmful chemicals and marketing them as something beneficial. And so the government was like, holy shit, we got to regulate this. And so that's where the FDA comes from, a position of risk mitigation. So it's not thinking about how can I improve something? How can I be more preventative? Even though there are examples of that, like statins, it's more about how do I solve something acute and remove risk as much as possible. And so that, with amounts of money that the trial system costs, which usually requires some pharma to put in money into these biotechs to even make it through phase 3 trials, makes it almost impossible for anybody to work on aging.
Yeah, that makes a very good point. I feel like I've heard doctors talk before about how the medical system is very good at curing or dealing with or managing acute things. But when it comes to chronic conditions like obesity, metabolic syndrome, insulin resistance, diabetes, their strategies are pretty terrible. So it's the kind of, I guess what you're saying is that people, the incentive structures set in place are such that it is going to incentivize people to want to address acute issues much more than long-term issues like, for example, aging or death. I guess if you're working on such a big problem of the root cause of aging, the root cause of death, the issue is who gets rich and when.
Yeah.
Would you say that's a particularly big part? Because like, when do you come out with the final products? Like, here we go, we got the thing that deletes aging. Now give me my paycheck.
Yeah. So I want to say two things about that. One is that a lot of actors want to do good things, but they're trapped in a problematic incentive or structural situation. So let's say that the FDA wants to do something about aging, which I'm sure many people at the FDA do want to, because they realize this would solve a lot of downstream problems and benefit a lot of humans. And a lot of people got into public service for very noble causes. The challenge is that approving something preventative has a very high bar, right? People say the FDA wouldn't approve water if it had to go through the trial system, because some people might be hurt by it. Of course, that's an exaggeration, but it does really clarify the point that if one person gets hurt and 99 people benefit, something might just not make it through. And so there's that kind of problem. And then you asked about the financial benefit and who stands to gain. Could you create some cycle of positive greed, let's call it, in this context? And there are two aspects that make this difficult. At least there are many others probably. One is, let's say you want to do a trial. You have an intervention that supposedly impacts aging. Well, how are you going to validate that it works? I mean, you probably need to do like a very, very, very long-term study and remove all confounding variables in some way that's highly convincing. The challenge is that a lot of interventions may have an impact on small parts of the population, but differentially on others, or the effect size is not that big. So let's just imagine some magical intervention which would extend your lifespan, your maximum lifespan, by 10 years. But you're 40 right now. So let's say your potential lifespan today is, I don't know, 85 or 90. You take good care of yourself, maybe 95, maybe you have good genes. And now we've extended that to 100 or 105. How in the world would we know if we actually did? First of all, we're not going to wait till you're 105, right? Yeah. Now, we might take a cohort of certain ages. Now, by the way, this intervention, does it work for 70-year-olds as well as it'll work for 40-year-olds? Maybe there's an argument to be made that you need to intervene early before certain processes start happening. And that makes it even harder to track. Now, you take a 40-year-old and you're saying, well, why don't I? And by the way, the FDA is open to what I'm about to say. They say, give me functional measures. Show me their walking speed, their VO2 max. Show me other stuff, but show me an effect size that actually demonstrates real change. And you need that over time. And it's very hard to do and it's very expensive. And most of the interventions that have been tried so far and that even make it to phase 1 trials are just not going to have a sufficient effect size. And so there's no motivation for a large pharma to say, hey, let me plop down $100 million and let's see if this works, because that's what it might cost to go through all the trials, even if it sufficiently works, which it may not. Now, let's just take a step back and think about the greed motivation for other aspects that might drive this. Generally speaking, venture investing, which is a world that I've been in, I've raised venture capital, I've invested in many companies that have raised venture capital, is based on these 10-year cycles. So you raise a fund, you deploy, you need to give the money back to the LPs in 10 years. And a lot of these initiatives are just not going to blossom in that timeline. So you don't have enough stuff which is ready for venture capital. And even if you did, then there's a question of, is the effect size going to be sufficient to then manage to pass through the FDA process? And of course, investors hate that. They're like this, it's not just about whether the startup can do the thing. There's like this government body, which we have no control of, which might just kill this, even if it supposedly works. And so there's not enough stuff that's mature, and the structural impediments of venture capital or limits of venture capital make it unlikely that this kind of stuff will be funded. And I guess maybe kind of as a end note, then the question is, well, how do you put more money into R&D? I mean, VCs don't fund R&D. That's like a charity. I mean, they don't know if they're going to get any money out of it. So who's going to fund the R&D? The NIH. But the NIH has their own problems in terms of the vicious cycle. So it's just very hard to have a cycle of greed. There's one example I'll mention called VitaDAO. Have you heard of that?
No.
So that's a DAO, a decentralized autonomous organization. So it's a concept that grew in the crypto world where people co-own and co-control or govern this organization, which has some economic motive behind it and systems and can be tokenized, et cetera, et cetera. And VitaDAO raised a bunch of money. And the idea was, hey, the owners of these Vita tokens can then govern where that money goes into different interventions. And then maybe in the future, they may have all sorts of benefits. They can promote longevity science, and maybe someday they might have preferred access to certain interventions. They'll certainly have more information available to them, et cetera, et cetera. And it kind of gets the power of the crowds or people who care about this to short circuit the institutional impediments to getting money into this space. But to give you an idea, VitaDAO in total has probably brought in, I don't know, like, low double digit millions. I mean, it's nothing compared to like the amount of money that goes into like just biotech investing is $100 billion a year. Okay. So like these are different universes. Speaking about this cycle of greed, right? If your problem is primarily that the work needs to be done at the R&D level, then how do you drive that? How do you get more money, but not just money, attention, people, excitement, inspiration around this?
As you're speaking about it, it becomes really interesting because it starts to turn the wheels in people's head of like, I think most people would assume that, oh, if there was progress to be made on aging, it would have been done by now. There's probably scientists out there spending billions of dollars on this. Yes. If this could be done, it would have been done, but there's no progress, so this is probably impossible. Right. But now you're kind of revealing that, wait, the incentive structures are not right. You don't really have a cycle that is conducive to actually making headway on this problem. So it's really interesting to hear just how little progress, just how little commitment is being made compared to what could be made when you compare it to other sectors, things like that. So another question I was going to ask you was, why do you think because even my perception was, probably not going to make any, personally, I don't think the optimal diet will make you live to 150, 180, 200, because it's natural for people to die at 90, 100. If they're super healthy, they'll die at like 100, but it's unnatural for people to die at 150. So a diet that optimizes your body to work perfectly, exactly how it's supposed to, it's going to die at around 120 because that's exactly what it's supposed to do. Do you have any comments on this to kind of reveal to people? I think you've already done a good job, but reveal to people how little effort is being put into this.
Yeah. So, we started with asking, okay, how could we get a large amount of resources to address this problem? And now, when we think about what we can do today versus what we could potentially do and how that corresponds with attitudes or kind of perceptions, because you were saying, hey, I had this idea in mind that maybe we're already trying pretty hard, or people they hear a lot of information. So they might read a book like David Sinclair's Lifespan, great book, and they might think, hey, it's just around the corner. We got this. Or they might follow Dave Asprey or somebody else, and they might think, and I'm not saying that Dave or other people are promoting this idea, but they might have the false idea that you disabused right now, which is, hey, if I have the right supplements or I take enough ice baths, I'll extend my lifespan indefinitely, which of course is nowhere close to where we are. In fact, we haven't extended maximum lifespan at all, period. So all the stuff that we've done, there's no evidence whatsoever that we've successfully extended maximum lifespan. And the number of interventions that are now approved to address aging is exactly 0. There are 29 interventions, by the way, that are in some phase of clinical trial that kind of purport to address aging. It's not clear if any of them will be approved. Maybe something will be approved. And this is, by the way, compared to one pharma like Pfizer and Novartis having 100 interventions in clinical trials at any given point. So 29 for the entire longevity industry or ecosystem world. And so is the question around how do we think about what can be done versus what could be done, or what are misconceptions, or what is driving people to these misconceptions? How would you frame that? I'm just trying to think where to drill in.
Yeah, in terms of where to drill in, I guess just because I don't really know what the average person's conception is, but I imagine that it is something along the lines of you can cure diseases but not aging. Yeah. If you could cure aging, something would have already happened. So I think people would kind of, it's a kind of unfair criticism given how little commitment is being made to this problem. But I imagine when you present the concept of vitalism to someone, their first thing is like, well, do you have any proof that you can even extend maximum lifespan? Is that even a possibility? Like, are you trying to build like, you know, a flying house or, right?
Yeah, great question. There are a few answers to that or thoughts about that. One is it the ethical thing to do to try to fight aging and death as hard as possible? And I would argue, yes, it is. And that would, by the way, address the question also, which is a really good, very fair critique, which is even if we put all the GDP towards fighting aging, maybe we are just not capable because we're too low on the technology tree. What I mean by that is an example that's been used before, which is, let's say Marcus Aurelius in the Roman Empire said, hey, I want to build a jet engine and put all of Rome's GDP into that. Would he have succeeded? Even with like happily sacrificing like 1 million slaves to this? Probably not, because there were so many preliminary technologies that hadn't been yet developed, right? And so you could argue that too. You could say, look, we just need more time and we're just not close to it yet. But I think you can short circuit that argument by saying, hey, but we have to try hard because it's the right thing to do. And we're not trying hard at all. So we could try like 1,000 times harder. If we try 1,000 times harder, you know, let's talk about that then. Because right now we're like at 0.001% of GDP, right? Where I'm saying in the vitalist perspective is let's get to 1% of GDP. Now, at least as a first milestone. But to address this other question, or the other side of this, is it possible? Is it even possible? Is this just a pie in the sky? And I think a lot of people are so conditioned to believe that aging and death are inevitable that they take it for granted on the one hand, but also they have a defensive mechanism not to even question it, because by merely questioning it, they would have to confront their own mortality. And there's nothing almost that humans prefer not to do but confront their own mortality. So there's like a very strong aversion to even thinking about this. But let's talk about this perception of inevitability just from a pragmatic sense. Does it hold water? And I'd say the answer is clearly no, especially in the last 35 years or so. So in the 90s, this researcher, Cynthia Kenyon, discovered that you could change one gene in worm, C. elegans, and extend its lifespan by about 100%, so doubling it. And by now, it's been shown that you could extend its lifespan by 10x. Now, you could say, well, okay, but humans are not worms. Fair enough. But until that point, biological science had never been able to intervene in such a way in the kind of machinery of life and extend lifespans at all. So you could argue, like in the 80s, you could just say, well, there's just like some stuff in there and we have no idea how this relates to lifespan at all. But since the 90s, we know that we can modify lifespan in some organisms. Now, since then, we've shown that lifespan, maximum lifespan and median lifespan are modifiable in mammals, specifically mice. So we know that mice that receive different interventions, including rapamycin, which you've probably heard of, do have extended maximum lifespans. So that, even though it's very far, and you could say mice aren't people. And actually, out of interventions that get to phase trials, only 1 in 20 things that works really well in mice will work in humans. But still, just think how monumental it is to say, as opposed to there's some gunk here and we have no idea whether this relates to lifespan at all in any modifiable way, to say we can extend the lifespan dramatically of a worm and substantially of a mammal. And this all in a relatively short period of time through distinct interventions that have been replicated. And so that is very suggestive that lifespan is modifiable with, at least the world of tools and capacity that humanity can bring to bear. Even if we're quite far and human aging is different in all these ways, and we might need to have some different strategies around it, etc.
I feel like if I was a billionaire, I would probably spend, 5% of my money at least. I would get a team of people and I'll be like, okay, you guys solve aging so I can live forever. And I'm just going to go and do my stuff. So you had a really good point about that. Why don't you share that with us about how much people are actually spending on this?
Yeah. So that's like the first thing that people gravitate to when they start thinking about why this isn't done. So they hear about some of the research that's been done that was just mentioned, and they're like, oh, wow, holy crap, that's pretty cool. But yeah, we get it. Like VCs won't fund it, but why doesn't like Jeff Bezos fund it, or, Bill Gates or whatever, right? Don't they want to live? The only thing that their money can't buy is time and health to some degree, right? And I've been thinking about this problem for about 2 years. That was where my intuition naturally went as well. And my conclusion is, and I'll jump straight to the bottom line, and then I'll explain why I concluded that, is that billionaires, they're just like the rest of us. So kind of like the Us Weekly commentary about billionaires, like, they shop at the supermarket, they get jealous, they whatever. There's something fundamental that's preventing them from investing in this. And I came up with something like at least 7 reasons for that, which to some degree represent the average person, but some are unique to billionaires. So those reasons are as follows. Number 1, a lot of them just don't want to deal with anything negative. Just imagine you worked so hard to make all this money, or you got so lucky to be the son of like some gajillionaire, and now you're a gajillionaire too. Like, why would you want to experience anything negative in your life? Everything around you is just about insulating you from negatives. And what's really negative? Aging and death. So, okay, that's like kind of off your table. You are not inclined to deal with this. And the systems around you are preventing it from even colliding with your world. Number 2, you're afraid of bad PR. Peter Thiel had this whole thing, billionaire hires blood boys, vampire billionaire in the valley, etc. And despite that being kind of like a ridiculous reason not to try to extend your own health and life, people are motivated by that. They don't want the bad PR. So like that might just cause them to shy away from it without really exploring it. Third, you're a billionaire. What happens to you all day long? You're getting pitched by the best pitch people in the world about anything. So just imagine the best pitch you've ever made. It's probably like 10 times better than that. And they're getting it constantly. So now to them, it's just like, somebody very attractive that's getting hit on all the time. They develop a shield. And so when they hear that pitch about longevity, they're just like, I don't know, longevity. I mean, they're just trying to get my money.
I see. So you get somebody who's like, we are on the cutting edge. We are the most advanced lab, but we just need the funding. If you could just give us a quick $1 billion, we'll solve aging. You're like, oh, come on, get out of here.
Exactly. They just think, and they got a lot of them either became billionaires or stay billionaires for a reason, which is they're, suspicious, like they're rational in a good way, right? Like they're not just going to buy anything that somebody sells. So that's another reason. Another reason is that they believe in an afterlife. So, that's still a lot of people. Maybe 50% of billionaires, like, maybe more than 50%, in their heart of hearts, they hold on to that hopium and copium that maybe death isn't the end. A lot of people are like that. Even people who profess to be secular and non-believers in an afterlife do hold on to that because the alternative is so terrifying. Mm-hmm. And so when confronted with an opportunity to work on this, they're just like, oh, but there's an afterlife. So why should I worry about this? Yeah. This is silly. So you take those people. Then you have the people who think only capitalism can work because they say, well, how'd I get to be a billionaire? Capitalism. So now these guys want me to give them $1 billion for some research project. So in other words, they look at it and they say, well, the technologies are not mature enough to benefit from venture financing, et cetera, to drive a good outcome. And therefore, there's just nothing I can do about it because capitalism is the only thing that I know that works. Which, of course, it's like a lot of innovation came from government money. Everything from DARPA to the benefits of NIH research, which yielded a lot of these spin-offs that then became companies, et cetera. But it's a way for them not to think about that. Another reason is that many billionaires are older. And so they think, I won't benefit. So it's going to take like 20 years. And I'm like 70. So I'm probably going to be dead by then. So it doesn't matter anyway. And they don't think like, well, it might benefit my offspring. People don't really think that way that much. Then another reason is they think, and this is a very common thing that many people think, what about the negative repercussions or the other corollary results of a world without aging? Overpopulation, billionaires aren't thinking about inequity, but other problems, right? I mean, maybe some billionaires are thinking about inequity. I don't know. But, and of course, these are, from my perspective, imagined problems because it's kind of like you look at the world pre-fertilizer, right? And you say, you have this Malthusian idea, people are just going to starve. But no, humanity has developed ways to produce more food. And who knows what's going to happen? Maybe in the future, we decide to have less children. And that's a call that we have to make. Is it worth dying for, or is it worth just continuing to age? I mean, think of the counterfactual. If you had a world with people and people were having too many children, would you be like, all right, well, let's just introduce this thing called aging that'll kill off some people. That's ethical. Yeah. No, of course, it doesn't make any sense. So a lot of these problems are imagined problems. And also they don't answer the fundamental question, being in tech and product development for many years of hey, you're worrying about what'll happen when you have 8 billion users. You have 0 users right now of this supposed product of longevity. And then finally, there's this perspective of there's nothing that we can do about it. It's inevitable. It's just this kind of very built-in thing. Maybe it's a desire not to confront aging and death, etc. And you think about it, it's not worth my time. It's not going to work. It's whatever. And you think about it as a lot of these billionaires regularly attempt to do the impossible. Go to Mars. I mean, this is all they do, these startup people. And especially when there is biological evidence that we can modulate aging. And even if it were so, then you would say, well, you know what? They should still invest a small amount of money. So let's say you're a billionaire. You were saying before, and I think very rightfully, you would assemble a group and you say, hey guys, you work on aging. And if the head of the group or the group said to you, well, Joseph, we just don't know what to do. Then you say, okay, take $10 million and come back to me with your best ideas. You got a year. Because $10 million, if you have $10 billion, is a pittance. And it's just worth it to you because you're I've decided I'm going to spend 5% of my net worth on this problem because I can't buy time right now, but I want to buy time and I want to buy health, etc. And so my inescapable conclusion, which goes back to the beginning, is that billionaires are just like everybody else. They do not want to confront aging and death almost no matter what. And there are 2 small things I'd add to this, which I think are interesting. One, you look at recent years, there's been a lot of noise about Altos Labs, the largest seed round in history, $3 billion, led by including billionaires, maybe sovereign wealth funds, etc. I mean, that's crazy. The biggest seed round in history for an organization. And then before that, Calico, funded by the Google guys, and then later partnering with pharma. And, there are questions about whether that's being effective or not. But the reason that those $3 billion came in to Altos Labs is because of this technology called epigenetic reprogramming. Have you heard of that?
Not too much. I feel like I've heard the word, but I wouldn't say I know much about it.
So when you think about your genome, you have your DNA, which is just the bases, right? A, C, T, G, which compose the genes. And then you have the epigenome, which are different components that latch on top of the DNA and activate or deactivate or impact the manifestation of that DNA into doing stuff. This epigenome changes with age. And there's some argument to be made that that is a component of aging itself, meaning that if you could reset the epigenome, that you could actually rejuvenate a cell. And by the way, we do rejuvenate in nature. Humans do rejuvenate, right? Aged cells of a mother and father produce a youthful cell. So how does that happen? There's an aged ovarian cell, and then you have a sperm, which, okay, maybe it was created, but it was created by an aged individual. So it proliferated out of something which was aged. And then you have a youthful offspring. And Vadim Gladishev's lab at Harvard showed that there's a rejuvenation moment in embryogenesis, where the epigenome of that new entity, the embryonic state, gets reset.
Oh, really?
Yes. So, and there's hardly any research on this. Okay, so there's a lot that we could be researching more. In 2006, if I'm not mistaken, Shinya Yamanaka, a Japanese researcher, discovered these factors, which when you apply them to, when you activate these genes, and you can activate them in certain ways, they cause a cell to become pluripotent, meaning assume kind of like a stem cell state. He won the Nobel Prize for that alongside somebody else. And so what that means is that you can take some cells, put them in a dish, apply these factors. There's a crude kind of description of this. And maybe some small number of those cells, 2 out of 1,000 or something like that, will become reset epigenetically. And to some degree, you could say to a very large degree, you could say they look rejuvenated, meaning they look like an earlier stage of development, like stem cell-like. Okay. Now, this doesn't impact the mitochondrial DNA, but the majority of our DNA is the nuclear DNA in our cells. And these cells that are rejuvenated, you could say, well, now you have this kind of stem cell. So it's what's called induced pluripotency. And then that cell could proliferate into different types of cells. So you could take, let's say, a skin cell, somatic cell, apply these factors, revert it, or out of a population, revert some of those cells to a pluripotent state, and then redifferentiate it into some other cell, like some sort of liver cell. And that liver cell is youthful liver cell. Now, it's not exactly 100%, but it seems to be directionally like that. And so that suggests that you could take your own cells, revert them, and then reproduce tissues that are youthful, rejuvenated tissues with your own DNA, which means that they wouldn't be rejected, for example, if they're reimplanted into you. This is a huge deal. Just imagine for organ transplantation or other needs. Even though we don't know how to create an organ because of the matrix and the scaffolding yet quite, but we're making progress on that. But you can imagine in 10, 15 years, this technology may truly solve that problem or solve it to a large degree. This is the reason that Bezos and Milner and these other guys put $3 billion in Altos because there was this innovation, epigenetic reprogramming, that made it feel like, hey, there's something here that may be manifestable in a, not a crazy, it's not some pie in the sky, it's something functional. Yeah. And I just want to say about that, just to add to that briefly, that it's a funny thing about, a billionaire who might say, well, I'll invest as soon as there's a good idea, which to me sounds like I would rather die than do anything to find a good idea. I'm just going to wait here passively, even though all my life I'm just like act. In this specific case, which my life literally depends on and my health and wellness, I'm just going to wait till there's a good idea and then I'll pull the trigger. But ironically, that's exactly what happened. And I want to add some example. This is something I've heard. I haven't read the primary literature, but it's a story, an example I heard from Robin Hanson, the economist. So I was at a conference and he was giving this example about people who were checked to see how they would respond to data about a prospective surgery and see a life-threatening surgery, cardiac surgery, and see if they would respond, how they would respond to data about the success of their upcoming surgeon. So just imagine you're going to get heart surgery and, doctors aren't necessarily forthcoming about this. It's not like they come to you and give you like a chart. Hey, here are all my surgeries. Here was like the percentage that didn't go well. And these people are now still like, having to wear diapers, even though there was success or whatever. But they were saying, well, you come to the office and you'll get the option to pay $50 or some such amount and see all the information for that physician and other physicians in some range and see their performance. And they found that nobody paid. So nobody wanted to see this data. And then they tried to give it away for free. And still nobody wanted to see this data. Okay, these are people who are about to get heart surgery. So like very high stakes. And then I asked Robin, what about showing it to them without asking them? Just like you come to the clinic and then somebody says, hey, as part of the process, I need to walk you through some of the data, blah, 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 right? Mm-hmm. And so he said they did that too. And it didn't change the selection numbers. In other words, the same percentage of people decided to stay with the same physician, even though that physician didn't have the best data of all the physicians shown. My point in that is that, and by the way, this is a story, I didn't read the primary literature, it could be off, but everything that I've seen in the last 2 years researching this suggests that, as crazy as it might seem, the reason people are not investing in this, especially billionaires and others, maybe the strongest reason, there are many reasons, is that people will simply do anything not to confront aging and death.
Like, is it that they're afraid of it, or does it just not compute for their brain? It's like, well, that is the point at which I cease to exist and I no longer experience the ceasement, the no longer experiencing. So it's just nothing. So it just doesn't compute for me. So it's not like I don't want to consider it. Yes. It's just like considering infinity. It just doesn't really make sense to the brain.
Right. Which I think is also a problem with saying live forever. I would never use such words because we don't have the ability to conceive of that really. What you're saying is very on point in that part of it is not knowing how to even grok this idea. There's another part of it, which is just like the terrifying idea of my own death and mortality, and maybe I'll suffer. And so trying to think about that is very unpleasant. People don't want unpleasant things. Mm-hmm. And I think what you probably will see, I don't know if they've done the study, is that if you delegate the decision to a loved one, that loved one will want to see the data. That's interesting. And so a lot of what I think about is, are there hacks where we can create a positive short circuit into our own psychology? Because we can all sit here and say, hey, we agree aging and death are bad. And by the way, pretty much everybody does agree. They just don't say it publicly. And what I mean by that is we go to war against aging, but it's a silent war. We go and get our Botox. We spend bajillions on cosmetics, plastic surgery, you name it, just to pretend that aging is not happening to us. So clearly we don't like it. And in addition, when people are in their last years of life or they get a terminal diagnosis, how many people say, I'll give you my whole fortune just at a chance to live another year, to be here to see my son's graduation, my grandchild's wedding, et cetera, et cetera. So in practice, we actually are going to world war against aging. We're just doing it in the silliest, most wasteful ways possible and not making any actual progress.
Maybe the thing that allows someone, just like you said, the thing that allows somebody to consider death is to be in this situation that actually makes them think, I am dying. And so now they have no choice but to confront it.
Yes.
So maybe the solution is not to do anything that would harm someone, but just, just give them like a little bit of ayahuasca. Yeah, just a little bit of ayahuasca, and it'll have them hallucinate. And then, maybe you can have someone guide their mental space such that they think they're dying. Yeah. And then they'll have develop this capacity to contemplate death.
I think that's spot on. And there are different ways that I've seen this manifest. One is when you look at the longevity space or people who talk about extending maximum lifespans, and we could speak about the different other types of segments that describes themselves as longevity. And I want to speak to that briefly later. But one group, which is very distinct, is people who had a near-death experience. And so they just kind of have this reset and they're like, holy shit, yeah, mortality is real. And I don't want it. Life is great. So I want to live. I want to continue to live as long as I can. And I'm going to do something about it. So I agree with you 100%. There's another aspect to this, which is called the aging suit. Have you heard of this thing? It's like a suit. I think it costs tens of thousands of dollars, maybe more. It's like a pretty expensive suit. And it simulates what it's like to be aged. So you put this suit on and you feel basically way down, and like you have these headphones and like these glasses that destroy your vision and hearing and make it hard to walk and difficult, et cetera, although not really, I guess, the aches and pains. So just add that on top of it. And it's so unpleasant. And it gives somebody this visceral sense that, holy shit, like this is what it's going to feel like when I'm like 70 or 80 and I'm still going to have like another 15 years to live. That sucks. We should do something about it. Yeah. Although, of course, in this case, it's a little different. But I'll just say about this longevity side, because something we haven't talked about yet, which is these longevity concierge practices, et cetera. There's a whole realm of what is kind of like the new wellness, which also labels itself longevity. That's also partially a reason why we think a new namespace, namely Vitalism, is required to distinguish itself. But in this longevity world, some people say, like, hey, you just need to win the centenarian Olympics. That's something that Peter Attia says. And I like Peter Attia's work. I think he's great. I'm a paying subscriber of his podcast. I follow it. And at the same time, this is something I disagree with, or I don't think is a good target, because what it suggests, the centenarian Olympics, the way he describes them, is a set of things that you should be able to do when you're a centenarian. So, you should be able to like lift your grandkids, squat, have this and that function, walk a mile at a certain rate, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, those are good things. And I hope my parents have that function given the current state of affairs. And at the same time, it sets in my mind an intolerably low bar for where we're aiming as humanity. Because it's basically saying, my goal is to be like a beat up Ford from 1950 that is somehow still driving miraculously. But that's not what I want. I want to be a brand new thing, meaning I want to perform the way I'm 30 at 100 or as long as possible. And so a lot of what you see today in interventions that describe themselves as longevity is essentially trying to avoid the diseases of aging. So in other words, they participate in the disease nomenclature or worldview of things, in that you are healthy if you are not diseased. And what is being diseased? It's having the label diseased. You have reached this threshold and now you have Parkinson's or cancer, et cetera, et cetera. Whereas like some people like Matt Kaberlein, who's also a longevity and aging researcher, et cetera, he'll say often, and you know, he's also a great guy who I follow and I'm friends with, and he says, I'm a degraded human who is 50 years old, a somewhat degraded, healthy human. You know what I mean? Or some words like that, meaning, you know, you're degraded. You're healthy. You're doing okay, but you are degraded.
I'm technically healthy, but I can't do any of those fun physical activities.
Or it's not exactly necessarily fun physical activities, but my function is not full compared to what it used to be. My maximum potential has been reduced. And so my range of function is also correspondingly reduced. And so when we play into this worldview of pathologies and labeling, we're essentially accepting a notion of healthy aging, quote unquote, which is accepting degradation. And I would call it pretty severe degradation once you hit 80, 90 without the terminal diseases or without the really severe chronic diseases of aging. And I just don't think that's a sufficiently exciting goal. I mean, I don't think it's the right goal, period.
It would be neat to see what would happen if, you know, all the resources that could be pooled towards this problem were pulled towards this problem, because it seems like the longevity research community, at least based on my limited knowledge of it, is kind of at an impasse because they've come to this thing called mTOR. You probably heard about that. And it sort of suggests, so basically the idea is you want to keep this thing called mTOR low because there's a lot of data in the lab that shows that if you keep mTOR low, the organism will live longer. But the only thing is mTOR is responsible for a lot of the benefits you get from exercise. It is responsible for the stimulus. It is basically the stimulus that grows the muscle. And as you age, you need more muscle to be healthy. So you get this kind of weird situation where it's like, we need to restrict mTOR to live longer, but we need muscle to live longer. So we need mTOR. So
it creates a contradiction in the impact of our interventions, which makes you wonder whether something is worthwhile.
But it also points out that we're not just floundering in the dark. It's like, oh, hey, here's a clear problem that resources could be put towards. It's not like there's this thing called aging. We don't know why it happens. We have no idea. There's, you know, we can't just throw money at a black hole. But it's like, hey, wait a minute. Maybe we can start here.
100%. And I would say that when you look at, so there's this company that Matt Kaberlein co-founded called Aura Biosciences, I believe. And they have this thing called a worm bot where they developed a machine to test different things on C. elegans. So this worm that we've managed to modify a lifespan in, and they can test things at a much faster rate than any system that's been used previously. So that they have this idea that they could test 1 million interventions and also different combinations of such over 3 or 5 years. And the total number of interventions that have been tested so far is like 100,000. So really radically expanding the space of what could be tested. And you can imagine finding something which depresses mTOR, but for some reason doesn't have those other negative effects. But we don't know about that. Which is to say that you're right. There's something to hold on to, at least to try to get to something better.
This kind of reminds me of something that we were talking about earlier about how I was saying I don't really think that maybe dietary intervention will allow you to get the most out of your maximum lifespan, but it's not going to extend the maximum lifespan. Right. So then when you're talking about things like this guy developed some research that suggests that in theory, you could kind of grow your own new organs that are yours, and then you could transplant those in. So these kind of, let's say, abnormal procedures, I think are really going to move the needle. On that note, are there, like, that's really interesting. Does anything else come to mind in this kind of, like, you know, maybe you're going to get something that will like completely renew your bloodstream, or you'll put a pump on the back of your head so it allows you to
clear your spinal fluid, or
exactly clean your spinal fluid, and then like make your sleeping process like 200 times, or 200% more efficient.
For sure. Yeah. So the example of induced pluripotency, I think, is a great one. And you wonder, when you implant these rejuvenated, supposedly, cells, will they retain their youthful character? And are there certain things that are upstream of certain parts of aging? For example, we have an organ called the thymus, which is very important in immune function. And the thymus degenerates into fat, so it becomes inactive. And the result of that is poorer immune function. And our immune system impacts many things, including cancer, right? We're developing cancer all the time, but the immune system catches it, even when we're youthful. So there's some idea that, okay, if we manage to regenerate the thymus or grow it in a dish and put it back in a rejuvenated state, that may have downstream implications through the whole body. And that might create some benefits that are beyond just that organ. But then on the other hand, you might say, well, you put these new cells in a aged environment with all sorts of inflammatory markers and senescent markers and all this stuff and elements. And after a short period, that will accelerate the aging or the decline of that that rejuvenated tissue. And we don't really know to what degree it's going to be this or that, but it's certainly worth exploring. Now, one other thing that we could do is genetic manipulation. So, for example, there's a company, I think it's called Verve, based in New Zealand, which is changing a gene that has to do with abnormally high levels of cholesterol. Just like PCSK9 inhibitors, which you may have heard of, which are an intervention that they give people who don't respond well to statins and are very effective at lowering LDL. This is a genetic intervention which would produce the same thing. Some people just have like abnormally high cholesterol or LDL, and those people, outside of wading into the discussion around whether LDL is directly upstream of atherosclerosis and in what way, but those people do in fact suffer from heart disease and related events. So there's an assertion there that intervening with the LDL could be beneficial to them. And so there's this company that's working on this gene editing intervention, and that might just work. I mean, they, I think, release some positive results. And so you can imagine that we find certain ways to change our genes into preferred variants. So for example, there's the Alzheimer's related gene, ApoE4, which raises the odds of getting Alzheimer's dramatically. I don't know if you've heard of this, but in the recent documentary with Chris Hemsworth, he discovered he has that variant. I forget if 1 or 2. And most people have ApoE3, but then some people have ApoE2, which is protective. So those people just like hardly get dementia, even in very advanced ages. And so you could argue, well, we should just gene edit everybody to have ApoE2. And this is like a single mutation. So a single gene change, that's really remarkable. Longevity in general doesn't line up that well from what we know right now. Although people are investigating centenarian gene sets and trying to find whether there are either certain limited polygenetic interventions or monogenetic interventions that could cause substantial increases in lifespan and or health span.
I think it was something like FOXO2 was implicated in higher incidence of being a centenarian.
Yeah.
Right. Which kind of goes back to the discussion. For example, have you heard of Brian Johnson?
Yes.
Okay. Did you look into him much?
Yeah, so this is a really interesting, different direction. I think what Brian is doing is amazing. Just for anybody who hasn't heard of this, Brian Johnson is a tech entrepreneur who sold a company called Braintree to PayPal for $800 million some years ago, I think maybe 8 years ago or a little more. And he started another company called Kernel, which is trying to analyze and intervene with the brain. So it's a non-invasive helmet that you put on and it analyzes brain patterns, et cetera, and may try to intervene in some ways with that. And then around 2 years ago, or a little less, I became aware of him. I mean, I'd heard of him in the context of Braintree, being a tech entrepreneur, and I even used his product before in my previous company. But I heard of him because he developed this thing called Blueprint. And Blueprint is his effort to maximize his health through science and a data-driven approach. And so the idea was, how can he take measurements of everything possible in his biologics and identify what is an optimum value and then carry out interventions to reach that optimum value. So the context is that they are tracking 70 organs, if I'm not mistaken. They're tracking hundreds of indicators. They're doing so many scans, et cetera, et cetera. And they have these different protocols that they're intervening with, including nutritional, exercise, supplementation, and medication. And he has a team, I believe, of 50 or 70 people, including many physicians with different specialties, et cetera, as well as other professionals who are iterating on him as the N of one that's trying to be optimized. Now, he also talks about how he wants to maximally extend his lifespan as well as his health span. Although, of course, the tools that we have today are still limited, and he acknowledges that, and his team acknowledges that. And he also has this idea that humanity should evolve and move and accelerate towards that evolution through science. And that's something which is, I'd say, different than vitalism. So vitalism is a more conservative perspective in that the goal is not necessarily accelerating human evolution. That isn't the goal. The goal is to extend and preserve our maximum health as closely as possible to the way humans are now, which is simply a conservative view, similar to medicine.
You don't want to change anything about humans other than the fact that they eventually have to die at, age 90 or whatever. Right. You'd like to extend that as much as possible while keeping people pretty much the same humans that they are.
Exactly. Okay. Meaning at function of their maximum potential, whatever that is, 30-year-old Joseph or whatever that is. Now, I acknowledge that we're going to have to probably intervene in some ways that are novel. But that being said, we already do intervene in our biology all the time to improve our life. I'm wearing contact lenses, which, are a kind of prosthetic, you could say. I probably wouldn't be able to survive in nature without this prosthetic. If I have heart disease and I need my heart replaced, nobody looks at me and would look at me and be like, hey, here's the cyborg coming in because he has a plastic heart now. Hey, cyborg. So, but of course we want to be very careful. And there's this company doing this gene edit, right? Yeah. In New Zealand, and nobody's batting an eye because it's dealing with something which is kind of a disease state. But that's just a label that we gave people who happen to have that mutation.
Just because I wasn't familiar with this concept of Brian's of humans need to evolve. Yes. Because I looked at his blueprint a little bit. I've looked at some of his videos. Really interesting guy. Yes. Got a lot of interesting stuff. But I wasn't familiar with this evolve concept. What exactly does he mean by that?
So a lot of what Brian talks about, and of course, you should interview him and ask him directly some of this. So I'm trying to represent what I've taken from it. reading his tweets and listening to interviews, etc., and having spoken to him once or twice, is that he talks about a personal journey where he had some self-destructive behaviors, and then what he calls evening Brian, which was the bad Brian who was making bad decisions that were harming his well-being, his health, his wellness, etc., and that he was trying to automate his life to make the decisions that could be harmful eliminated. And so in that way, he ties this notion of blueprint, the tracking and the optimization, to this idea of automating and taking away the decision-making from, quote unquote, the fallible human element into a different system. And some of what he talks about, and he's talking about this thing called zeroism, which is maybe a philosophy that aligns with that. He's working on publishing something in that vein, is the idea that by developing AI and other technologies, humans will evolve into delegating more decision-making to these creations of ours and essentially evolving ourselves through that improved decision-making and a convergence of self-modification and science. And that's a more, I would say, transhumanist in the kind of futuristic sci-fi sense, which is something I'm wary of because we don't really understand it well enough. And when you try to make substantial changes to anything, especially something as complex as human biology, you might end up with some very, let's say, unanticipated results. And I think life is a miracle the way it is. So we should try not to vary from it very much to the degree that we can.
So the thing about AI that is scariest for me is the idea of the whole careful what you wish for thing. You give the AI a goal and you might set some parameters, some boundaries so it doesn't do certain things, but then it might do this other thing that was totally unexpected that you couldn't have predicted. And it was really bad that it did that. It took that particular route, but it did actually achieve the goal that you set for it. You know, a silly example would be something like, AI, please get rid of brain cancer. It's like, okay, I'll just kill all the brains. I'll just delete the brains and there's no more brain cancer. So then, and then the other thing is, have you seen that TikTok trend? It's been popping up. I've only seen it because it's on Twitter, but it was, I think it's called being an NPC. It's like these live streamers.
Yeah. Ice cream, yum, yes, et cetera, et cetera. And it's kind of like, if we just allow AI to create the thing that is most addictive or most successful, that is it.
Right. Yeah. So these cute women somehow figured out, probably through trial and error. Well, one of them figured it out, and then many others followed suit. They're like, oh, if I want to optimize for revenue, here's a specific set of cadence with my voice and the type of intonation I should use while I'm saying yes popcorn, or like what motion I should do, and that gives me the most emojis, and these emojis cost money. So then it's kind of like, okay, what happens if we instill these new motivations for humans that do not derive from basically what a human is? It's like this new thing, this new hybrid of like human plus AI, and we've delegated most of our decision making, so we have basically set up new incentives. So that kind of scares me.
Yeah, it scares me too. And it makes me think about this YouTube video called Who Am I?, which is talking about like how people may change into some sort of cybernetic organism in the future progressively by switching out different pieces of their body, et cetera, and eventually switching out their brain. And then like, when are you human anymore? Where is the human part? When does that go away? Are you still you? And I'll just give an example of this, which comes from personal experience. So I used to really try to track my habits, meditation, getting enough water a day, exercise, you name it. And I even built an app for it called Superhuman Goals. And I thought, what if you could break down the path to mastery of anything. So you could just like see the way Joseph does it, the way Tim Ferriss does it, and you can like combine and control and track and carry out the habits because, you know, it's the actions that produce the outcome, right? And I did that for a while. And then I had a moment which was almost like an existential crisis where I asked myself, well, let's say I could just snap my fingers and then it wouldn't be a struggle anymore. I would just, like an automaton, sit down on my mat and do the 20 minutes of meditation or the hour of meditation every day on the clock. I would go to the gym when I decide that I need to go to the gym, on the calendar, on the clock, just like with this iron discipline. You know, I'd take the discipline of Arnold Schwarzenegger or Michael Jordan or whoever, and that would just be a matter of like constant in my life. Would I take that intervention if offered to me right now? So if I could take a pill and it would change my brain to be like that, would I take it? And I was just thinking to myself, well, if you take this line of reasoning to its logical conclusion, you end up obviating a lot of what it means to be human and fallible. Fallibility is part of being human. And am I willing to part ways with that? I asked myself. And my answer was, no, I don't want to part ways with that. And then as a result, I like, you know, for like a month, I just like was like, whatever, I'll meditate whenever, I'll go to the gym whenever, right? But I started feeling worse, of course, because these things do make you feel better, right? So like over time, I kind of gravitated to it in a less intense level. And even before, I wasn't like super intense about it, but I was following it, right? And I think where I land today is that some of these questions are very nuanced, fundamental, complex, hard to grok. Where is it going? If I can take this thing that's going to make me more disciplined, should I take it? Well, guess what? If I'm tired, I take some caffeine in my coffee. Or if I'm going for an important test, maybe I hit a Red Bull before so I can perform my best and get that perfect score. I use the stimulants, right? And people use all sorts of interventions to impact their own performance and their behavior right now. Oh, I feel nervous. I don't feel enough courage to talk to that person for, I guess now people don't consume alcohol that much, but until recently it was like, oh, I'll just drink, you know, a shot and I'll feel more relaxed and maybe I'll be able to.
In Japan,
yeah, right. Or whatever it is, right? So it's like we already do these things to a degree, but we're going to become so much more efficient at doing them that it brings up some fundamental questions about who we are and what we are. And I guess my conclusion is that we will be forced to grapple with these questions. We are already grappling with some of these questions. And what I hope is that we do things that are preserving of the beautiful parts of our humanity to the largest degree possible. And that's what makes me, I guess, a little bit of a conservative in that way.
That's really interesting, especially with the discipline. Like, let's say there's a pill that would just give you infinite discipline and then nothing would be difficult to do.
Right.
But then the issue with that is kind of how hunger is the best spice, struggle is the best way to make something really satisfying when you finally achieve it, right? Yeah. It's like the struggle necessary to get there made it more satisfying. And I think there's particular brain regions that the same brain regions, well, what the brain scan would suggest was that the more difficult someone evaluates something to be, the more they expect the reward to be great or nice. So it would suggest that the brain is hardwired to associate high difficulty or high struggle with more satisfaction, more pleasure, and more. Yeah. So I guess the thing is, but that's really cool that you're thinking about that part too, because I guess the only way to start addressing these and start having to solve these problems is by getting people to actually start delving the resources into this to start making progress and see what comes up. Because I imagine, and you sort of touched on this earlier when you're talking about the billionaires, but I imagine some people would say like, well, if there is no death, like let's say wildest dreams come true and you guys totally eliminate death. Then people would say, oh, wouldn't that be a bad thing? Then people would say like, well, what's the point of, I could make an amazing company now, or I could make it in 20 years. I'm going to live forever. So like it kind of ruins motivation or something.
Yeah. I'd say a good question in the sense that it comes up frequently, that kind of idea. I think that it could be addressed in a few lenses. One lens is the counterfactual. Would you introduce aging and death to a world without aging and death? It sounds pretty unethical to do that. Second lens is to say, well, if there is no death, does that mean that, do we mean by aging or by any means possible? Meaning, an asteroid could hit the Earth. That might still kill you, even if you've solved aging and you've solved all these other things. And so I don't presume that we're going to solve death anytime soon. I think we should focus as much as possible on it. And the first thing we should solve is aging. And if you die and, bad luck of the draw, hey, it is what it is. It's still going to be tragic. And in the long, long run, we just don't know enough about what reality is to kind of evaluate where this is going and how humanity or how the universe will change or what it really is. And so there are at least two sides to this. One side is to say, unless you're absolutely certain that you can't die, so you're like kind of like some sort of Highlander or vampire, then like, well, you don't know you're not going to die. So you live as if you might die. And so you do feel a sense of urgency. And it doesn't matter if it's 50 years or 100 years. People modify their expectations based on the reality, right? Like when it was normal to live to 50 or to 60, people thought somebody 50 was like an elder of the community. And nowadays that's no longer the case. Somebody 50 is like, look at Tom Cruise. He's like in his 60s or whatever. And he's, nobody is thinking like, oh, that like geezer or whatever. I mean, maybe some people think that, but you know what I mean?
Actually, you might be able to make the reverse argument of if things become such that you have a lot more people living towards, say, 140, 150, sure, it might actually increase motivation to do things that would help people on the whole. So it's not even like, oh, I'm not going to do that because it'll take too long. And, to be frank, I don't really care if, my granddaughter gets to benefit from that. They might now be saying, oh, that takes 40 more years. Okay. I'll be around when that happens.
Look at climate change. That's like one of the main arguments there, where people who say, oh, the boomers didn't care about climate change and now we're paying the price, blah, blah, blah. And they don't care because they're going to be dead. Yeah. Right. It's almost exactly that. And it's beyond that. It's almost like, if people live longer, there's so many benefits of that. The relationships, the capacity for reinvention, for exploration, for creativity. And what is to me the most important exploration is exploring the true nature of reality. And I don't think that will go away anytime soon. And, we're just so incredibly ignorant of it that it's impossible to even say how close or far we are. And I'll just explain what I mean because it's a little hard to grok. There's some movies that discuss this, like this existential question, like The Matrix or The OA or Everything Everywhere All at Once, which are kind of questioning, well, what is reality? Are there multiple dimensions? Is the reality that we experience the real reality, or what is the underlying nature of reality, right? I mean, like since Einstein, we have this idea that space-time is one thing. I mean, think how weird that is. Space-time, what does that mean? And just imagine the leap from the pre-Newtonian physics world to Newtonian physics to Einstein and today. And just imagine what would the next three leaps be and what would that describe in terms of what is reality. It's unimaginable. I mean, that is the literal description of what it is. If you ask somebody before Einstein, can you imagine that future? Nobody would be able to imagine it. And so we can't imagine it. We need to continue striving to try to understand reality at deeper and deeper levels in more expansive ways. And that is, I think, the most exciting adventure and exploration of all. And it's almost like, to me, and I have kids now, I see my daughter, you know, she's born into this world. She doesn't know anything. She just asks questions. What is this reality? Is there like, what is this world? Like, you tell her, like, oh, we're on this earth, and earth is like this like ball of rock floating in a void. And it's like, we're surrounding this like fusion furnace. She's like, what's fusion? She's like, what do you mean void? And why are we floating? Isn't it, what's going on with this floating thing? And you're like, holy shit, this is like pretty crazy stuff. If you hear about it, having not assumed what reality actually is. And so you think about that and you're like, well, that all of what I just described, if you described it to somebody in the 14th century, you'd be burned at the stake. So just imagine what is like the next thing that we can't describe today, which we will describe in 100 years or 500 years or whatever. And I just think about that and I'm like, wow, I want to be around for that. I don't want the book to end. And I'm going to fight as hard as possible to stick around for that.
How would you go about achieving the goals set out with Vitalism?
Yeah, so we were talking about this notion of getting large amounts of resources to try to address the core problem, specifically aging to start, because that's the primary cause of death. And one core insight that Vitalism has is that if you want to fight hard, you want to look at how humanity has fought hard before. And a lot of things that have been monumental efforts that were successful were done at the jurisdictional level, meaning often governments. Now, that doesn't mean there aren't a lot of other ways that there could be progress, whether through people like Brian Johnson or celebrities promoting the movement, or companies that promote these ideas to their audiences and make them normalized, etc. But using the power of governments is extremely important because they control so many resources. And that's true on the healthcare level. Like the US, for example, spends 17.4% of its GDP on healthcare, of which about a third is spent by the government. That's like about 1.5 or so trillion dollars a year. And a lot of that is spent on the last years of life, meaning trying to extend lifespans, but in a very poor way, the way we discussed before in the conversation. And so then the question is, well, how can you influence governments? How can you get that level of reorganization of society and reallocation of resources? And so we look at past movements like the American Revolution, like the climate change movement, like Mormonism. You know, Mormons were discriminated against, and then they moved to Utah and they became a local majority in that state. And, you know, I think people take for granted that Mormons aren't discriminated against elsewhere, really. You know what I mean? It's kind of like, if there were no Mormon-oriented state, would they be as protected as a group, or would they have as, you know, as much benefit? And then there's the Free State Project in New Hampshire. Have you heard of that? No. So this guy, Jason Sorens, who was a grad student, I believe, in economics at the time in the early aughts, wrote this paper about what if we, all of us libertarians, move to or convince people in a certain US state, especially maybe a small one, to be libertarian or to promote, to try to get influence in this, at the state level, and made that a libertarian paradise. So that would be a state that is truly libertarian. And then he put out this paper, a lot of people responded, and it became a movement, the Free State Project. And that project then over 2 years kind of evaluated different states that they might want to focus on. And they tried to reach out to governors, et cetera, et cetera. And only one governor actually solicited them, the governor of New Hampshire, which, you know, is already kind of libertarian leaning. Their motto is live free or die. And so eventually they held a vote and they voted on New Hampshire, and people started moving there, and locals started being engaged with this movement. Anyway, long story short, it's been about 19 years, but they currently have free staters, or people who identify with this, as representatives of 26 out of 400 seats in the New Hampshire Assembly, which is really pretty crazy. Now, it's not a majority, but it's something kind of inconceivable. And a lot, libertarians generally want to defund things. You know what I mean? Not always, but some. So like for them to have more influence in government has some, I'd say, internal tensions in some places, depending on how it is, right? Because the people employed by government are like, well, are you going to cut budgets or whatever it is? Even though not all of them believe that, many don't. They have other strategies around like creating more freedoms. But the point is that there are certain examples of movements that get influence at the jurisdictional level, whether that's a state, a country, a special economic zone. Like there's a zone in Honduras called Prospera, where you have a legal framework that allows different progressive regulations and everything from biomedical research to other development like using drones in airspace and things like that. And so a lot of that aspect of vitalism is asking ourselves, how can we interface and identify opportunities to get jurisdictions to be more committed to the values we believe in? And I'll just give a few examples of where I think and how I think this can happen. So in Montana, they recently passed a law, you may have heard of it, which allows any intervention that passed phase 1 trials to be recommended and implemented in the state with physicians signing off on it. This is really incredibly different because no other state, as far as I know, allows that. They only allow things that are not phase 2, phase 3 approved for terminal patients. And the change in Montana, it makes it available to everybody. So what you should expect, and by the way, this was just passed 2 months ago. Almost nobody's heard of it, or maybe a month ago. And the senator who passed it, this guy, Ken Bogner, really forward-thinking guy. And there's this organization called A4LI. I think it's a4li.org, which is promoting longevity and very similar. I'd say it's a vitalist organization in terms of the values it promotes. And it helped passing this bill. The interesting thing about it is that Montana is fully Republican, House, Senate, and governor. And yet they passed what I consider to be a very forward-thinking, or maybe I would call it progressive, although it's not progressive in the way that a Republican would call it progressive, because it's all about my body, my choice in a lot of these jurisdictions. My point in giving this example is that different jurisdictions will be more amenable to different kinds of interventions or improvements. So when we think about the regulatory system, a more libertarian country or state may be open to progressive regulation, which kind of believes in this my body, my choice idea and allows faster iteration on interventions that can impact longevity. Another jurisdiction, which is more oriented towards, let's say, government intervention, might do things that we may both agree are positive, like taxing highly processed foods or, sodas that have too much sugar. Like Berkeley, I believe, does that, and some other jurisdictions, which like Republicans would never accept because they'd call it nanny state-ish, right? So those jurisdictions could do that. And those jurisdictions could also dedicate more money to R&D. It's going to be hard to convince a libertarian or more conservative or more, let's say, financially conservative jurisdiction to say, hey, let's raise our graduate student or post-secondary budget in state and fund new departments at state universities to study X, Y, Z. But states that are more government-oriented or countries might do that. And so then the question is, how do we create centers of influence in all these jurisdictions, whether they be countries, like a small country like Montenegro is very longevity forward thinking, or a canton in Switzerland, or a country, maybe at the US level, at the federal level, or at the state level. Yeah. And the way we think to do that is multifaceted. On the one hand, establish critical masses of vitalists in these different jurisdictions. these may be people who already live there, and maybe people move there too because it becomes a magnet for people who are like-minded. And then the more you have these people, especially if they vote as a bloc, they can, we believe, create substantial influence to push forward these kind of changes. Now, it won't happen overnight, but there are examples like the Free State Project and other examples which make us believe that in 10, 20 years, there could be really dramatic impact from this. And certainly if there's an economic ecosystem of companies, which is the other piece of this, that promote the mission, which there already are some, but we really want to substantially accelerate it and expand it. We think that these kind of critical masses will grow and grow until they become a huge tide that no politician, nobody who has influence can ignore, because it just makes sense and it will elevate the status of everybody in these jurisdictions.
Interesting. How long do you think that'll take? Let's say we get, the first seed of people who are really into this idea.
Yeah. Great question. So if you look at the Free State Project, they had their first representative in the New Hampshire Assembly within 2 years. And in total, if I'm not mistaken, only about 9,000 people or so have moved into the state. This is a state of 1.1 million people. So having 26 out of 400 in the assembly is really punching substantially above their electoral expected weight. And of course, there are people who were already living in New Hampshire who are also voting for this. But the fact is that they've jumped on this train too, right? So this movement managed to assemble a certain level of influence. And that's, within 19 years, but the first rep was within 2 years. I believe that with Vitalism, the goal should be to have substantial areas where we're making an impact within about 5 years. And so the nature of that impact can be different, right? Like the bill they passed in Montana is really important. And that probably took a year or two for A4LI to push together and help get passed into law. I mean, led by this senator and other allies there. And I'll just give some context. You look at those numbers from New Hampshire, the smallest Swiss canton has about 16,000 people. And Swiss cantons are autonomous in many ways, including taxation, education, and other factors. A small country like Montenegro recently elected a government which is very pro-longevity. It's a country of 600,000 or so people, but they control their immigration. So for example, let's say you have aging researchers in Indonesia, India, China, Russia. Guess where they can't get in? The United States. So maybe they can make a center of excellence for longevity research and also consumer products in Montenegro. And so we can try to encourage that. And so I feel when you're talking about some of these numbers, it's plausible to have real change with relatively small numbers of people, let's say thousands or tens of thousands per jurisdiction within 5 to 10 years. And by the way, this also, when you think about like the federal level in the US, because, not everybody necessarily believes in this in Montenegro or in Delaware or in some small state, Hawaii, wherever it is, or Montana. But there are also districts for representatives, and those are all over the country. So there might be a district like in Austin or in Boca or in Scottsdale, Arizona, or in San Francisco that already has a lot of people who are kind of into this anyway. I mean, they agree that like sick care is wrong and we should be more preventative and it doesn't make sense, etc. And you could even imagine in those areas that a small number of people voting as a bloc would really change the calculus of the representatives. And you don't need that many of them to start making change, to start allocating budgets, etc. And then, you hope some other good things continue to happen. People who are high profile speaking about this, more media being created. I'm part of this DAO called Jellyfish DAO that's working on creating media that's positive, longevity positive, etc. And so that's the answer. I think 5 to 10 years is feasible. We'll try to make it as soon as possible.
What would be really interesting is if we developed a technology that could basically slow down the frame rate at which someone is perceiving reality, so they could see like every millisecond to millisecond how everything is occurring. So for example, let's say you could investigate like, what are the exact sequence of feelings and events that are happening in my body that causes this feeling of anger or happiness or despair or something like oh, it was like this 1 2 3 4 5 6 7, because it just all happens so fast. It just feels like it just happens. It's just one flow. But then what if you could like slow it down?
For sure.
So, to your point, so if we can live longer, we have more time to dedicate to these kind of questions. And it kind of sounds like people would be more motivated by these questions. Like if we solve the whole, nobody's worrying about diabetes, heart disease, cancer, obesity.
Yes.
They're like, well, we got to worry about something.
Yeah, exactly.
Let's figure out reality.
But yeah, some person might be like, you know what is it going to be like if we have a way to experience the world visually more like, I don't know, a butterfly, which can see different wavelengths than we can see. What would that be like? Or just different, you gave this example of slowing the frame rate. You could think about certain animals that flap their wing like some insane number of times a second. And you think about like, how are they experiencing reality? Are they experiencing it slow or not? And also, could we change the fabric of time? What is the fabric of time? And what is this universe? I just think it's so incredible. I mean, that's the positive side of things, right? We get to live this reality with so many unknowns.
Some of the first place my mind goes when someone talks about the nature of reality is meditation and psychedelics. And you don't get it all in one retreat, or you don't get it all in one dose. So it would be nicer to have like a longer runway to be able to experiment. It's like, okay, I can work on my spirituality after I, spirituality or investigation of reality, however you want to frame it, after I complete this or that goal. And then, it keeps getting pushed back. So then I think people's motivations would change a lot if we had a significantly increased lifespan.
Yeah, 100%. And it sounds exactly like this idea of knowing thyself and going through that process and exposing different layers and different lenses into it, which is amazing.
I wanted to mention before we close out on Brian Johnson, I think the really interesting thing about him is he's a good example, I would say, of like, I don't know if you would really align with him, if you would describe him as a vitalist, or if you think of him as helpful to vitalism. But I think he's a pretty good example to get people to start thinking of like, what are the possibilities? Because while I actually disagree with a lot of points of his protocol, I think what he's doing is awesome, because he is basically just saying, okay, whatever, I've got this huge team, they're going to dig up all the science, and then I'll do it, and then I'll record it all. And then when we see some changes, I'll change it. So, he just kind of started. So he's got, from my perspective, I don't really agree with that. I don't really agree with that. But then Brian 3.7 or version 4.7 might have like this amazing protocol with all these different devices we never heard of. And, he's looking like, whoa, this guy like actually looks like he reversed himself by 8 years. So the thing is, the further you go into the dark tunnel, the more you can kind of see what is ahead of you, right?
Yeah. I feel very similarly. I very much appreciate what he's doing. He didn't have to be public about things and open source a lot of the experiments that he's doing. And there's a cost to that. Maybe the benefit to him outweighs that cost, but that doesn't make me any less grateful that he's sharing it, because I think he's creating a lot of benefit for a lot of people. And I would say that philosophically, he might self-identify as a vitalist, but maybe not, because his philosophy seems to be more oriented towards intentional acceleration and accelerated evolution, and maybe a little less conservative. So I feel we're much closer to each other philosophically than many others. And in a sense, the mere willingness of his to say, death is bad. I want to live as long as possible, and so should you. And normalizing that and showing that, hey, I have a lot of money and I'm putting my money where my mouth is in this way. And I'm doing it scientifically. I'm not trying to sell you a network of clinics. I mean, I don't know. Maybe he's going to sell some things with Blueprint. But it feels to me like if he sells some things with Blueprint, that might be a positive cycle of greed. Because he would be investing that in doing more experimentation and open sourcing that and incrementally bring us to that, whatever version, which is beneficial. So by and large, I do see his contribution positively, very positively. And at the same time, there are some nuanced differences that are important.
It seems like a lot of these rich types are very competitive. So we might get another guy being like, I'm gonna show this guy who's boss. I'm gonna spend $20 million a year. And then maybe his protocol will be better,
I love that comment. And I think it comes across, for example, there was the All In podcast, Chamath and Dave Friedberg. And anyway, so it's a podcast where these guys who are wealthy tech moguls talk about different things. And they were talking about Altos Labs, right? And of course, they're talking about it because like Bezos and Miller are in it. Yeah. So like, what, we're not going to talk about, Jason Calacanis and I think you make a great point that there are certain short circuits where when even one person normalizes a thing, it can have outsized impact. Now, I'm not saying that like just getting Brian Johnson or Arnold Schwarzenegger, who recently was on the record in an interview saying death is horrible. I don't want to die. I don't understand. This is fucked up. Why do people accept this? With Danny DeVito, I'll forward you the interview. It's an amazing interview. He seems to me a total vitalist and is a legend in many other ways. But even though I don't think that one person will necessarily make this mainstream, I do agree with you that certain ways of normalizing it, creating positive competition and elevating it to a thing that's aspirational is critical. So I think about those things a lot and how we can, help people trying to do that.
There might have been a bunch of researchers saying like, we need ice bath research. There's nowhere near enough ice bath research. And then this guy Wim Hof comes along and he kind of like you said, normalize it. It makes it cool. Yeah. Now everyone's taking ice. I don't know if that really led to more ice bath research, but it did make it a big thing, and people are trying to.
100%. And a good example, I think, is Tom Cruise in Scientology. I mean, it's remarkable that he was so outspoken about his involvement in Scientology, and it didn't hurt his brand. He's just, despite critiques of Scientology, not been impacted, and I think he probably brought them a very substantial amount of normalization.
That's a really interesting point.
And he's just like one person.
Right.
So look, it can happen, but when we're talking about aging and death, it's just such a monumental thing in terms of the resources necessary and trying to address it, that it's hard for me to believe that any single person will make that big of an impact when you're talking about kind of a more celebrity perspective of things. Of course, there might be key leaders, just like, the founding fathers of the revolution. There were a lot of founding fathers. They were important, right? But I hope that through these different efforts, we'll be able to get some real acceleration.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Very cool. Anything we're missing? Anything you wanted to mention? How people can follow you? Twitter?
Yeah, for sure. So I'm on Twitter, Adam Gries. That's ADAMGRIES. And of course, I'd love for you to join us at Vitalism to just become a vitalist and help this mission. If you feel it aligns with your values, you can check out more at vitalism.io. It's just the way that it sounds, Vitalism. And I think that's it.
Cool. Awesome. Thanks so much, Adam.
All right. Thank you.
Yeah.
It was a pleasure.